Hi, everyone. Welcome. Hey, everyone. Welcome as you're coming in. Welcome, welcome. I think most of you are in, but I think there's going to be some trickling coming in. So make yourself comfortable in our virtual room. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome. My name is Sari. I'm the Public Programs Director of MOFAD, the Museum of Food and Drink. So great to have you all in our virtual space this evening. We're so happy to have you here. You are welcome to have your camera on or off, whatever feels more comfortable to you. We just ask that you stay muted throughout the conversation. Thank you so much for doing that. So if you've been to MOFAD Zoom events before, welcome back. If this is your first time coming to a MOFAD Zoom event, welcome. It's so great to have new faces. Let us know. There's a little chat button at the bottom. I would love to hear where you're all watching from. So if you could tell me where you're watching from, I'll write like, hi, so you see where the little chat function is. That would be really cool to see where everyone's tuning in from. And maybe some of you, someone's like, I'm here, have been to in-person, hello, shout out to Boston, have been to events in person in New York City as well. So that's great. Very cool. Yeah, we love doing virtual events because it's so exciting to hear where our larger community is watching from. So really, really great. So welcome. This is the Museum of Food and Drink. We're on Zoom. As you know, I am recording tonight. So just keep that in mind if you want your camera on or off, that this will live on our YouTube archive eventually. Oh, so many fun places. Yes, Maine, Pittsburgh, very, very cool. Oregon. So the way it's going to go tonight is I'm going to introduce our wonderful speakers. I'm going to pass it over to them, and then there's going to be about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A, which we're going to use that little chat box for, and you can type your questions there at the end. So I'm going to start with our featured speaker, guest of honor tonight, Dr. Alex Ketchum. She's the faculty lecturer of the Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies of McGill University in Montreal. She's the director of the Just Feminist Tech and Scholarship Lab and the organizer of Disrupting Disruptions, the feminist and accessible publishing, communications, and tech speaker and workshop series. And of course, we're here tonight because of her book, Ingredients for Revolution, A History of American Feminist Restaurants, Cafes, and Coffeehouses, which is her second book. It is the first history of more than 230 feminist and lesbian feminist restaurants, cafes, and coffeehouses that existed in the United States from 1972 to now. She is a third book in the works that will historically contextualize the relationship between feminist ethics and AI. Super cool. And moderating for us this evening is my pal, Dr. Casey Hysmith. She's a North Carolina-based writer, a food historian, a recipe developer, and photographer. She holds a PhD in American Studies from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her dissertation, #FoodHerStory, Food and Americans' Women Political Resistance from Suffrage to the Digital Age, brings together her research interests of food, gender, and the digital landscape. She is the co-author of Saltbox Seafood Joint Cookbook and the associate editor of Edible North Carolina, A Journey Across a State of Flavor. And she's also the social media manager for MOFAD. Yay! So this is so fun that we have these two amazing women in conversation this evening. So I'm going to pass it over to Casey, and then I'll see you at the end of the night after the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Sari. I am just so excited to talk with you, Alex. And I think we've been revolving around each other for some years now too, and kind of talked in DMs and have never actually had a chance to talk about your amazing work and the things that we both, have worked with. And I'm just so excited to now be here with your book and to hold it in my hands, which feels so cool because I just remember when you started this process, and I'm very excited to ask you a bunch of very nerdy questions about it. Should we dive in?
Yeah, it sounds great. I'm so excited to be here, and thank you everyone for watching. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate your support of this project.
Alrighty, let's dive in. So I have a bunch of questions, and so we can bounce around however makes sense. I think I have them vaguely in chronological order, but we will see how it goes. But I think a great place to start, and it's a story that you and I have kind of talked about, but I think it's a great one for others to hear, is the story of the cover of the book, which I'm now realizing my screen's a little blurry.
I can hold it.
There you go. So tell us about the inspiration for that.
Yeah, for sure. So thank you for that first question. Okay, so for folks, if you haven't gotten your copy yet, on the cover, you can see the kind of like text, the font, and this kind of loose line drawing of a radish. And this cover is based off of the Bloodroot Feminist Vegetarian Restaurant Cookbook.
I can hold that one up too.
Oh yeah, awesome. Oh, it's blurring it. Yeah. So there's a Bloodroot Feminist Vegetarian Restaurant in Bridgeport, Connecticut, founded in 1977. They were a collective. They still exist today. So if you haven't been and you're located nearby to Bridgeport, I would totally recommend going. But over the course of their 45 years plus of operating, they've released numerous cookbooks. And for their first 3 cookbooks, they kind of had this aesthetic that we wanted to pay homage to with the cover. But I also went with lavender as the background cover. I was very fortunate that my press was very encouraging of me sharing suggestions and feedback about the cover. It was wonderful to work with my press on it. And I wanted it to be lavender in reference to the kind of lavender menace, which is what Betty Friedan notoriously called lesbians within the feminist movement. She was worried that lesbians would ruin a kind of politics of respectability. So that's why it's lavender. And then the designer picked a radish. And I was like, oh, is this because, you see it as feminist restaurants are doing something kind of radical, but they're still having to operate within capitalism. So it's radish. And she said, oh, I like that interpretation, but I just thought a radish would be cool. So I like the narrative that I came up with, but either one works. So, yeah. And as Casey was saying, it has a nice feel on the hands. I appreciate that my press went with a nicer quality paper.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book. And I think it's really great for those of you who haven't gotten your copy yet. There's some really great images, and then this wonderful timeline in the book, and then this awesome directory in the back. And I think just the way the book is set up allows you to really enjoy all of those features really well. So I will stop gushing about it now, but
thanks. Can I say one thing about the directory?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Yeah. So and it has to do with kind of the method of research in this book. So for folks who don't know, there wasn't ever a directory before of feminist restaurants, cafes, and coffee houses. I had to make it, and I can talk more about that process if you want in a moment. But so as I assembled this directory, it went through many different iterations. I had it on a website. It still exists on a website, thefeministrestaurantproject.com. And I got feedback from different people who gave me other suggestions. And I think because I see my scholarship as something that's contributing to a brick, like a piece of the whole, and I want others to build on the project, I wanted this directory to be published in print as well as available online so people could find it more easily and delve into some of these histories in more depth if they want to study their local feminist restaurant history or their local kind of lesbian business space history, if they're really interested in looking at like what was going on in Southern Florida or what was going on in Arkansas, and they can look at the directory and see some.
Absolutely. And Sari threw that link in the chat for anyone that wants to look at the feministrestaurantproject.com. So you can go poke around there later. But yeah, tell us a bit more about kind of these methodologies that you used. And then thinking specifically of kind of, I know you said there wasn't a directory per se, but there were like versions kind of, right, with the Gaia guides. Can you kind of speak to those a bit?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I'll talk about kind of like 2 or 3 major components of kind of the methods that I was using. So I was really interested in looking at this kind of history of feminist restaurants. I've been really interested in questions around gender and food. I was co-managing my school's organic farm. I was running this living community called Farmhouse. I was majoring in feminist studies, and this was all at Wesleyan University. And a friend said, hey, have you ever heard of Bloodroot? It's just 45 minutes down the road. So I was like, okay, I have to check this place out. I convinced a friend to drive me. because I didn't have any other way to get there. And I thought it was amazing. So I decided to start looking into the history of these spaces. I knew about Bloodroot, and I was able to ask Selma Miriam and Noel Fury, who were part of kind of the original group of founding it. Selma was the original, and Noel joined a few months later. But 45 years later, I think we can call them both originals. And I asked them a bit about other feminist restaurants they may have heard of, and they were a bit kind of like loose on the details. But I contacted, so this was early on, this was over 12 years ago. I contacted the Schlesinger, which is at Radcliffe of Harvard University, because they have a huge archive of kind of women's history. And I said, hey, I'm interested in kind of food and feminism. And they showed the Bread and Roses collection and kind of Patricia Hines's papers. And I contacted the Sally Bingham archives as well, located at Duke. So those were kind of the initial places that I started to look. And the whole my undergrad thesis wasn't just on these spaces, but I continued to think about it, and I wanted to build on it in my master's and my PhD, and eventually what became this book. And so I contacted every feminist archive in the US and Canada, every like queer, lesbian, LGBTQ kind of archive in the US and Canada, because most places weren't categorizing things as feminist restaurants. So I had to kind of say, like, hey, is there anything that might be in there? Because it wasn't necessarily showing up in finding aids. I also, when I found a feminist restaurant, I would ask if I was able to contact the person, ask them if they knew of other places. Some archivists told me, oh, there's nothing in our archives, but I had a friend who ran a place, or I remember going to. So there's a bit of word of mouth. I also looked through the advertisement sections and the articles of so many, like hundreds and hundreds of copies of feminist and lesbian periodicals that were circulating in the 70s and 80s and beyond. I also found, as you mentioned, these kind of Gaia's guides or Gaia's guides. The kind of pronunciation is debated between people, but it's spelled like Gaia. And they were these women's travel guides. And women here was kind of code for lesbian, but could also be questioning women or women who are kind of, you know, interested, but might not have identified or were bisexual, or so women kind of gave this openness. And they were these travel guides. And in it listed locations such as bars and restaurants and cafes and bookstores and community centers and the Metropolitan Community Church. And so there's all these listings, and sometimes there's very little information about them. And they came out once a year, and I was able to locate almost every edition over time between visiting archives, ordering ones online that came from Germany, from used bookstores in Germany. And I was able to mostly assemble these. And I also looked at the Dameron's travel guides, which are like kind of focused more on gay men's culture, as well as the Dameron Women's Traveler and Spartacus and local travel guides. And then I also did oral histories. And then there was a lot of ephemera. So the other thing I looked at was there were concert posters of traveling musicians going from place to place, which was wonderful because I could look at like Alex Dopkins' travel poster. She was this lesbian folk singer. And so that was really useful. And then it kind of changed over time, in which the internet looked pretty different in kind of 2011 when I started this project versus, 2022 when this project really wrapped up. I mean, it really wrapped up around 2021. It just takes a little while for the book to come out, but some people started to share certain recollections, or other people would connect with me. And then as I was building these directories, I was trying to get every bit of information I could. And then I kind of released a version to the public that had just like the names and some of the dates that I had based off of the travel guides or other information. And I shared those on Facebook groups of like kind of older lesbian feminists that were like 70 to 80 years old. I asked them if I could talk to them. And I also put the maps in the directory online and invited people to give feedback. So I know that was a really long answer, but it was great. To the fact that I had to develop a lot of different methods to kind of track these places down. And the directory is, it's quite comprehensive in the book, but I still update the online one when someone tells me about another place. It will never be perfect. And part of that also has to do with like how I'm defining feminist restaurant.
That's amazing. And I love that the technology, you've acknowledged that, which I know is a big part of your larger body of work too, is AI and digital humanities and how that influences both food and gender and all these different aspects that are so intertwined. So I think that's really awesome, and excited to see how it evolves too. We can all watch it now because it's online. But I think backing up too, now that you have this giant collection of feminist restaurants and coffee shops, I feel, this is I guess a hard question, but in your best, in your opinion, how and why, what are the parameters for making a feminist restaurant, if you had to outline them?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, I'll answer this question in two ways. I'll answer it first in terms of how I defined it for the book and the project, and then also kind of what that ended up entailing. So I didn't want to be too prescriptive in how I was defining feminist restaurant. So I don't know how much people have in kind of a background of kind of feminist studies or feminist activism, but there's a lot of types of feminism, and there's debates within those types of feminism, like Marxist feminism, socialist, anarchist, liberal, radical lesbian, separatist, and so forth, right? And then there's kind of different generational ideas around kind of feminism, if feminism is trans inclusive or trans exclusive, right? So there's a lot of debates about what is feminism to begin with. And I was worried if I was trying to make this kind of distinction based off of my own parameters, I would include or exclude things, and it would be too much focused on kind of my perspectives. I was rather more interested in restaurants that called themselves feminist in either their title or their marketing, or if like an owner that did tell me like, oh, this was for sure a feminist restaurant. So there are cases where it was really explicit, like Bloodroot, whose name is literally Bloodroot Feminist Vegetarian Restaurant Bookstore. But there are other ones where they would talk about it in their advertising, or it would be something like Sister Moon, Feminist Bookstore and Cafe, or something like that, So that was kind of the definition that I used. So you'll notice in the directory, there's ones that I put for sure feminist, and ones that was like maybe feminist, because there were spaces where all I found out about them was a business card, or they were mentioned in the Gaia's Guides, but there wasn't that much information about them. And Gaia's Guides at one point used a star system to say if something was a feminist business, and then they stopped using that exact same star system. So there were some places where it was literally just a listing or an advertisement or one concert poster or a ticket stub from an event. So if they called themselves feminist, I was really interested in why were they choosing to designate this restaurant as feminist? What were the stakes in that? What were they trying to indicate? And what did that mean for them? And so then this gets to kind of the second part of the question, which is what did it actually look like? And so part of it had to do, so none of them are exactly the same, right? They're not a chain. There's different owners. Some are like owned by a single person. Many, especially in the 70s and early 80s, were run by collectives. And so everyone has different ideas of like how they're going to kind of live out their feminist ideas. But some things were generally shared. So there was an interest in disrupting hierarchies of traditional restaurants. So many of them got rid of waitressing, had people busk their own tables. This also had the added advantage of not needing to have as many employees, as many were operating on very, very slim margins. Many of them, but not all of them, were vegetarian. And then as we've kind of seen shifts over the years, like in more recent ones, it tends to be more vegan food, or at least vegan food items on menus. So many of them did what we would call today as like kind of crowdfunding. They didn't call it that way at the time, but there was kind of a crowdfunding aspect. Many of them were connected with other kind of feminist businesses or organizations in their community. So for example, in Boston, there was this kind of feminist nexus in which there's a feminist credit union and Bread and Roses, and there's the feminist bookstore down the way, and they're all located in a kind of similar area. There was always an inclusion of kind of women's culture. And again, here, women is kind of coded language for saying kind of lesbian and lesbian feminist culture, but in the 70s and 80s, they often called it women's culture. So that means art made by women on the walls usually. They would play women's music, which is like the name for this kind of lesbian feminist musical movement where Olivia Records produced a lot of music. But even if they weren't playing those musicians in particular, it would oftentimes be music written by women musicians, right. And they would have events that way. They would usually try to employ women from the community to do different types of jobs. So they would try to hire women plumbers, women real estate agents, you know, like for all the tasks, which sometimes was difficult. So there's times when founders of these spaces say, we really wanted to hire a woman carpenter, but we couldn't find any in the area. And we looked and looked. Right. So there was this whole idea of kind of like employing other women. There was this whole aspect of like how they saw their food as feminist or not, but maybe that's better saved for another question because I can speak to that for like a little while. And then there's also oftentimes, I mentioned the events. So they would bring in speakers, musicians, there'd be political rallies. And so it was kind of trying to work on bringing feminism into kind of every aspect of the restaurant, whether it was through the menu, which we can talk about more, or through kind of the cultural vibes of the place, or in terms of kind of how the restaurant functioned. Many didn't have tipping. They saw tipping as kind of a problem. So they would have tip jar, like a jar that would be instead for community organizations, funding softball teams or bowling leagues or other kind of charity kind of organizations. And then within the kind of collective, some of them would rotate tasks. So there's this whole idea of that everyone would do different kinds of jobs. And some of these tactics worked well, and sometimes it caused tension. But, you know, when you're working with people, that can happen.
Yeah, and working with people while still trying to balance the, you know, you're still within the capitalist structure of the restaurant industry. So having to navigate that. And I think your book does that so well. I was telling someone earlier today about a chef actually, who's navigated this more and is a man, and telling him how it would be a really cool book to understand some of these like really intense just logistics that were hard to navigate, like money and licensing and things like that. And I actually want to back up because I realized I got ahead of myself, and I'm sure we're all very aware of this, but I know we have folks maybe from all over. And I know that, you know, Canada's history with feminism is different than the US. Especially right now with, you know, Roe v. Wade being overturned, our most contemporary history here. So I wanted to back up and ask you why this time period, the 70s and the 80s, why this time period in particular? And again, I'm sure we all have some idea of the issues women were facing and other marginalized groups at this time were facing. But what else was happening in this time? And then specifically, if you could speak to some of the Canadian connections there too.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so first we'll start with the why this time period, and then kind of like what else was in this kind of surrounding political climate. So the reason the periodization is from 1972 to 2022 is because 1972 is when the first feminist restaurant was founded that kind of called itself as a feminist restaurant. So it was Mother Courage in New York City. And there was a lot of attention in both feminist presses and in kind of mainstream presses about what does it mean for this place to be a feminist restaurant. And it was kind of a like hangout hotspot with lots of kind of feminist celebrities going to it. It had feminist art on the walls. There are kind of debates about how good the food tasted or not. That was kind of a big part of some of the restaurant reviews, but it was culturally really important, and it definitely inspired the creation of some other places. And that's why it kind of starts there. And then 2022 is, you know, when I wrapped up the book. But also the 70s and 80s were really important in kind of feminist activism. So there's a lot of kind of debate about when do certain political movements start or end. You may have heard of the kind of wave theory in which second wave feminism is kind of the 60s, 70s, early 80s. And then there's kind of third wave feminism. First wave is seen as oftentimes and in 19th, early 20th century. And I'm a huge fan of the wave theory because it oftentimes really focuses on kind of white middle class women's political experiences of feminism. And it also kind of erases or hides a lot of other activism that was being done like in those kind of periods in between that was also feminist work. But we oftentimes see kind of debates about when this particular kind of swell of feminist activity was happening. And so it depends whose history you're looking at. So in the US context, some people kind of look at Betty Friedan and the feminist mystique in 1963. And that was definitely an important text, especially for white middle class and upper middle class kind of housewives and their experiences and bringing them into the feminist movement. If you're looking at more like women of color, especially Black feminists who first start to get into kind of feminist work, some of it happens during the civil rights movement and the kind of sexism that they faced within advocating for racial justice. You also have some younger white women from the North who also like went down. It's not to be ageist, there are people of all ages, but you have this kind of movement of college students from the North also coming down and taking place in the civil rights movement. And also having their consciousness raised, not only about racial injustice, but also sexism. There's also a lot of the kind of anti-war movement and the student movements that are happening at this time. And there's a lot of attention drawn to issues of power, issues of who has the right to have a political voice. And there's this kind of emphasis on the personal being political. So that's why you kind of see this building up in the 60s. And it kind of leads into in the early 1970s, we see some shifts happening with kind of US American feminist activism and the establishing of kind of feminist businesses, such as feminist bookstores, gift shops, and the restaurants, cafes, and coffee houses. So that's kind of on the US side. In the Canadian context, similar things were happening, but the timeline, the periodization is a little bit different. And basically by 2 years later for some of like the major changes. That's not always the case for kind of the US and Canadian comparison, but when we're looking in kind of the 60s and 70s, we do kind of see like some of the stuff that happens in the US, then a couple of years later, it happens in Canada, like 1 or 2 years later. And some of that has to do with the emphasis of when we're looking at kind of academic feminism and what's happening on kind of university campuses in Canada. Part of it is that US American feminist academics are coming to Canada. And so there's that kind of impact, but also the Canadian context is made complex by the fact of Quebec, because Quebec is also going through its own quiet revolution.
Right.
And the pushing out of kind of the Catholic Church in some ways, because every street is still named after a saint.
Yeah.
But the pushing out of the Catholic Church from a lot of kind of administration and political power. And so the feminist movement looks really different in Quebec. You don't have as much kind of separatist movements as much because a lot of kind of white Francophone feminists in particular didn't want to separate from like Francophone men because there's already kind of its own sovereigntist or separatist movement already within Quebec. And there is also kind of this like, we can try advocate for our rights within the kind of structure of Quebec. Now that time, that movement was really tied to kind of a larger social safety net and the creation of $5 a day daycares. We now have $7 a day daycares, but like that same kind of system. So it's kind of a complicated history. And I could have started the periodization earlier in that there are other kinds of restaurants that existed in the early 20th century, really tied to kind of suffragist movements in the US. And so there's this book called Selling Suffrage that speaks to this, but basically there were these restaurants that would try to like essentially lure men into them. They like
grabbed men off.
Yeah, exactly. And say like, we'll provide you a cheap lunch. And then basically on the table, there'd be all this information about why women should have the right to vote. So it was feminist in the sense that it was a restaurant talking about feminist productions, but those restaurants were really about kind of impacting men and trying to sway their political ideas. Whereas the feminist restaurants I look at in the 70s and 80s were really about creating space primarily, but not exclusively, depending on the space, for women to kind of build feminist community. Not always separatist, but sometimes to have just kind of a space apart from mainstream culture, to be together, to enjoy certain music and food. And then as we move, there's kind of many of the restaurants founded in the 70s and 80s start to disappear by the 90s. Part of it is that, I mean, some of the restaurants existed for a year and a half. That was pretty common, especially for collectives. It's hard to work with people. It's hard to run a restaurant. Yeah. And many people in the 70s who started them, not all of them even had any restaurant background. They're more interested in just creating a space, and they're like, let's do it through food. Whereas in the ones started in the 80s, many of them had more kind of business experience. You see kind of like knowledge being passed down. But by the 90s, you kind of see changes in feminism. There's a little bit less of an emphasis on needing that kind of women separate space. And also some of the like earlier restaurants, people are getting tired, or the economy also goes through a bunch of different changes. So they start to close down. So that's why it's kind of 1972 and 1989, because I didn't want to like jump into the 90s, though some of them, were still existing. So that's kind of why there's that periodization. But we see a rise of a lot more explicitly titled feminist businesses, like bookstores and cafes and coffee houses and restaurants and eateries and food businesses, kind of around the like 20-teens. And as a lot of that is also tied to kind of the rise of Donald Trump's political power. And so there's a reaction to that. So before he even is elected president. And so there's this desire to really create small local businesses that are going to create community and act as a form of resistance. And so this is when you have kind of a rise of a lot of newer feminist bookstores that also sell coffee or food, or kind of feminist restaurants, in part as like political reaction and protest to the kind of rise of Trumpism and kind of these new far right movements that we see happening. But these restaurants and coffee houses and cafes look a bit different than the previous generations, because while the ones from the 70s and 80s, they tended to be run more by white, disproportionately Jewish compared to like the larger population in the US. So many Jewish women were involved, and lesbians. So white Jewish lesbians are the most represented. And then the kind of coffee houses, the temporary spaces, have more women of color involved. By the 20-teens, the spaces tend to be run. There's a lot more women of color involved. There's a move towards, rather than just lesbian, more like queer space. There's a lot more trans inclusion. So while there were trans inclusive spaces in the 70s and 80s, and anti-racist spaces in the 70s and 80s, we see like a lot more emphasis on anti-racism, trans inclusion, and kind of feminism open to people of all genders across, in like a gender expansive understanding.
Absolutely. I think one of the things, I guess it's more of a comment that I had, that I loved as a scholar myself, but also just as someone that I really like when things are broken down in really helpful ways, is the terminology section that you have. That there's a bunch of different terms in there that kind of get to everything, but you have a whole section that really breaks down what you're talking about right now, in what women, the coded word women, and all the various spellings. For folks not familiar with it, there were 1,000 different ways to spell women, especially I think in the 70s and 80s. I don't think we really use any of those spellings anymore, that were coded in all these different ways. And I think that's a hugely helpful thing. And I assume it was really helpful for you too, in terms of like being able to keep track of all these wonderful terms too.
Thank you. Yeah. Terminology is hard and tricky, right? So I said about like how it was difficult to define feminist restaurant. Also, like, how am I defining who's using these spaces? This was even a question within the spaces themselves. And I had the chance to listen to recordings of feminist coffee houses where they would set a tape recorder in the middle of the room and just have their meeting. So it's kind of really hard to distinguish who's speaking and what's happening. But it was such a fabulous way to get kind of an insight of what was happening at the time. But But yeah, there's a lot of debate about who do we mean by woman? Who is this for? Do we mean lesbian? Why don't we just call it a lesbian coffee house? Oh, if we call it lesbian, then like women who aren't sure won't come, or women who are bi won't come, or, not every like community uses the word lesbian. That term can like dissuade people. Do we use woman loving woman? Do we mean this in kind of the way that the Lesbian Her Story Archives in New York uses it, where like Dolly Parton's book is included because she talks of her love for women? Is it like that kind of expansiveness of woman loving women? Is it like cis women only? Does this include trans women? There's a lot of debate, and it's really challenging because not only are there all of these different terms, but their connotations can be so specific to a certain region and time. So if we look at the example of women with the X in it, which we see today, for some communities, that is a trans inclusive way of spelling women. For some communities, that's a trans exclusive way of women. So it's actually really complicated. And so I tried to kind of lay out that complication and also draw attention to the fact that these are conversations that were ongoing in the 70s, 80s, and continue today. And that's why I think we also have this kind of move, one of the helpful kind of moves towards queerness in the 2000s and above, does allow for kind of like a broader expansiveness. But then there's also times that people say that there's also kind of like a changed community, right? So I think we gain a lot from this kind of broader expansiveness, but you're always going to have debates of who's included, who's excluded, what does the space mean for them? And so I think different generations of feminists also see the spaces as changing, but I think that's okay. I don't think that's something bad. I think it's just every generation is going to have different needs.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think what is also probably changing, but maybe somewhat the same, and something that we started to talk about a little bit, but I think we should circle back. Since this is the Museum of Food and Drink, we should talk about the food and drink.
Yes.
And then specifically in your book, a couple different times, and it's like a larger theme that kind of runs throughout, but the cooking problem. Yeah. And what it means and what does it still mean today, but then also what it meant in relation to the food that these restaurants were serving, the food and the drink. I remember looking at the menus, the bread and roses menus, and just thinking these are great, but then you keep flipping, and then occasionally there was a problematically named racist dish occasionally, and so not just the food itself, but then kind of our the way the food was identified too, I think is really, really telling and really, really exciting to unpack as well.
Definitely. Okay, so I see that's kind of like a two-part question, so I'll speak to that.
All my questions have multiple parts.
No worries. No, it's great. It'll probably take me a couple minutes to speak to it. So with the cooking problem, so for those of you who don't know, the cooking problem is this concept that kind of shows up actually in a lot of feminist humor pieces in the 1970s. So there's Judy Cypher's Why I Want a Wife, and there's like a bunch of other kind of similar pieces that were published. And it's basically talking about what I called in my undergrad thesis back in the day, because I wanted to use big fancy words, unremunerated domestic food production. But basically it's this idea of unpaid labor of cooking, right? Which includes everything from grocery shopping or, growing your own garden to get the food, grocery shopping and procuring the food, preparing it, serving it, doing the dishes, dealing with leftovers, all of that, right? It's very time intensive. And so there's all of this writing about what are we going to do with the cooking problem in the kind of early consciousness raising manuals that were distributed, which were these manuals that was for groups of women to come together to oftentimes sit in a circle and talk about like different ways that sexism was impacting their life. And there are these manuals that had kind of a week by week kind of discussion questions to kind of help facilitate this consciousness raising. And in one of these manuals, it said, don't let anyone serve food, because women are so often expected to host and serve food. So we want to take this away. But there's also that tension, because it's food creates community, it brings warmth, it can connect people. And what made me really interested about this was I love cooking. I was working on a farm. I cared about food politics, but there's still this gender issue, right? Women were still disproportionately doing most of the home cooking, whereas like men were being celebrated as world-class chefs. And there's a lot of work kind of about the Michelin chefs and, you know, all of the kind of food rankings and all of that, and who's seen as a worthy chef, who's seen as a cook, it's gendered, it's racialized, and all of that. So I first thought feminist restaurants were this kind of way to get out of the cooking problem. Women could get paid for the labor of doing their cooking, right? But that wasn't really the story. I mean, one of the things that was appealing to some of the women who started these spaces, like Selma Miriam said, that she knew how to cook, she liked to cook. So this was like kind of a way to build out a women's center, was that she could have a bookstore and she could cook food and create community that way. But for many of the restaurants, it was really about kind of creating this space. It wasn't, so there's kind of this divide about the role of food in these restaurants. And so there's examples of women who loved cooking. They saw food as really integral to their feminism. You see that with Bloodroot, where their cookbooks are really explicit. They're basically part manifesto, part cookbook, and that they're like, this is what we see as feminist food. It is seasonal, it is local, it is, you know,
the titles of the recipes alone are just wonderful and radical. It's great.
Exactly. And the early cookbooks then have like quotes by their famous feminist authors that they love. And I've been able to go through their archives at Yale, and it has all these letters from folks writing in, like saying, yes, you can use my quote. Yes, you can use my art. You know, we look forward to seeing you next time we're in town, and all these types of things. So, so there's some that are really explicit. Within the ones that are explicit, usually feminist food tends to mean that the ingredients are like good ingredients. And so there's kind of different opinions in what that means. So for some, it's local. Some, it's that the farmers are being paid properly. For some of them, it's that they're not going to like break picket lines for like certain kinds of like fallow grapes. For some of it, it was when Anita Bryant was doing her homophobic campaigns and was working with in Florida with like the citrus board. They refused to serve orange juice. So that happened. The Brick Hut in the Bay Area was like, we're not going to serve orange juice, even though they mostly served breakfast. Like it was a big breakfast place. They served other meals, but yeah. Some of them, it was kind of how the food was branded, right? So it'd be the names of the dishes. So there's places that would just name every omelet after a famous woman or a feminist figure or political activist they admired. So part of it's the branding. Part of it is also, right, the way the restaurant is operating, who's cooking the food. For some of them, it was about honoring different cultural heritages of the people who worked in this space. So, showcasing a diversity of kind of cuisines and backgrounds and introducing customers to a diversity of foods. Some of that was using food to connect with their larger community and bringing people in the neighborhood into the space. For some of them, it had to do with kind of the pricing of the food. So they wanted food to be accessibly priced. Now, this creates a problem. And I have this diagram in the book that's a triangle. And it's kind of like this balance of trying to find. And so, you know, you're trying to have good quality ingredients, maybe locally sourced, seasonal. Then you're trying to make sure that the people working in the space are properly compensated, right? When people like a living wage. And then you're trying to have dishes that are not too expensive so that people can afford them. It can be inclusive, especially for women who are getting paid significantly less in the 70s and 80s, but still we have this disparity today. And you're trying to balance all of that. And that's really challenging. So some created dishes like sliding scale soups or pay what you can dishes, so people could kind of create that balance. So it was always tricky to kind of create feminist food. And for the ones who saw food as integral to their feminism, that was especially a challenge. And like I mentioned before, this kind of emphasis on vegetarianism and later veganism. But there's also ones where there's this restaurant, and it shows, this example shows up actually in Afin Enke's book, Finding the Movement, which is focused kind of on the Midwest. And this group of lesbian feminists were doing all this work to kind of get a place ready to open. They were like, this is going to be a great restaurant. It's going to be a great community center. And it's Susan B's in Chicago, and they're so excited to open it. And then the night before they open, the woman's like, does anyone know how to make soup? Because she had never thought about it. It was supposed to be a soup restaurant, and she didn't even know how to make soup because that wasn't the point. It was about creating this community center. So the way they kind of lived out feminist food varied. But yeah, so it's a long answer, but there's a lot
great. That's wonderful. And you know, it's every single place had its own approach, like much like, you know, there are lots of different definitions of feminism, and so it tracks. It works. I have a bunch more questions, but I do want to pivot because I do think we have a couple trickling into the Q&A. So I will start with those. We might bounce back to my list if no one else has any more, but please add any other questions you might have or comments that you would like me to read out loud in the chat, and then I will share those. So I think our first question is from Julia, and wants you to speak a bit more on the appendix to the book, about the geographical mapping. So I think that's speaking on the directory a little bit. I don't know if Julia was with us at the beginning when we were talking about that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I can speak about the maps in more detail too.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So I spoke a little bit about in the beginning. And so Julia, if you did hear this, I apologize for the repetition, but about kind of how I created the directories and looking through feminist periodicals and travel guides and word of mouth and oral histories. And I went to 19 different archives physically in the US and Canada. So collecting all these materials and trying to create the directories. But I thought would be really useful to visualize. And so this kind of comes with some kind of funnier anecdote. I wouldn't say funny, but I spent all this time trying to learn GIS mapping software. So I'm not trained as a geographer in any way, but space and place is really important for this project, right? And so I found this one type of mapping software, which allowed people to create accounts and like drop pins and share memories. And I spent all this time kind of talking to different geographers, doing all this research, trying to find like the best way to create maps where people could interact with it. And this was around 2013, 2014. When I was new to my PhD. And so some of the mapping technologies have changed since then. There's been new software that's developed. But I found this one and then no one wanted to use it. People just wanted to email me information that was the platform they're comfortable with, or they want to write me handwritten letters to tell me about spaces or send me news clippings, which happened, which was great. So I realized that after all of that, the software that was most appealing to people because they were comfortable with it, because it was easily accessible, they could create their own copy, was Google Maps. So after all of that time, but you know what? That's like part of that was a learning curve and lesson that was really useful. And so I started these maps back, you know, in 2013, 2014, but there's been some amazing mapping projects that have been done more recently. So there's mapping the Dameron's guide. So they're actually, it's like a larger research project with Amanda Reagan and Eric Kanzaba, in which they're going through and listing every type of business and everything in the Dameron's guide across the US. And they have a bunch of research assistants putting information in, and it's a fabulous project. And then there's also an amazing project that is mapping lesbian connection. And so they're looking at different ways of like lesbian spaces. So that's also like a newer project that's happening today. And it's ongoing and will hopefully be made available to the public within the next year or so. Yeah, so there's been some cooler projects since with that. I think, you know, one of the funny things with working on a project for a dozen years is that now knowing what I know, I would do some things differently, right? Some of my approach with some of the guides, yes, I looked at the gayest guides, but I think I would have done some like other kind of systematic mapping of kind of every guide. Like I would have gotten every copy of the Dameron's Traveler versus what I could just find in archives. I would have been even more systematic. So I try to use this this kind of quantitative methods in addition to my qualitative work, but I think I would even like mix that up more. And another thing is that over the course of the pandemic, a lot of lesbian and feminist periodicals were digitized.
Yeah.
Which, wow, being able to use Control F and word searchable instead of going through all of them, that would have been amazing. And I could have more gone through like every edition very quickly, whereas I was hand flipping through stuff. So it's amazing how in like 10 plus years, there's just so much change. That would impact things. And there's also been other projects that have come out in the kind of intervening years. But I see that there's a question from Avery. Julie, I hope that spoke to it. If you have more questions about it, I also included to kind of show what it would look like if I looked at a specific year in a specific city. I have like, if you're mapping all of the businesses, just to kind of show what could happen. But
thank you for that. Yeah, I'll go ahead and read Avery. So this is a great one too. This is a big one, Avery. So I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of it. So Avery wants to hear more about how these restaurants were intertwined with the vegetarian movement.
Yeah, for sure. So there's like a few ways that this happened. So part of it has to do with kind of 1970s kind of countercultural movements, which were especially kind of in like white countercultural movements. There's a large emphasis on kind of back to the land movements and this interest in kind of vegetarianism, also tied into this kind of exploration of what they called like Eastern philosophies or like Eastern religions. And so an emphasis kind of on Zen Buddhism, which is like a vegetarian tradition and stuff like that. So you have this kind of hippie granola exploration of kind of vegetarianism, which oftentimes had like preparations of food that sometimes were a bit bland and weren't as like involved in kind of these longer traditions of vegetarian cooking, which exist in many different societies. And that's something that the people who run Bloodroot have spoken to. They're like, there's amazing vegetarian food in so many different regions of the world. Why don't we learn from folks from those regions? And many of the women who have worked at Bloodroot come from a large variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds and from like around the world, and many are immigrants or, you know, first generation folks. And so, for example, they're bringing in kind of their cultural knowledges to have like really good food that's built on these traditions. And this question of the vegetarian movement was also something that posed some challenges for me. So, when I was trying to find like what's a feminist restaurant, because early on in the project, people said, well, what are you going to do about Moosewood? You know, Molly Catton's Moosewood books. I love those cookbooks. They look like they're handwritten. The earliest ones were, you know, because it's a social justice restaurant, but it's not explicitly feminist. And I was like, well, it's vegetarian. It cares about like the ingredients, but they're not really saying something explicit. So there's also this kind of tie-in with kind of social justice and vegetarianism. Now there's the feminist restaurants who are vegetarian from kind of an eco-feminist perspective. So they really see the oppression of women and the exploitation of animals and women as intertwined. So part of it kind of has to do with kind of like Carol J. Adams's work on sexual politics of meat and who has access to meat, who's eating meat. There's different ways of like tying like violence against animals and violence against women together. So there's also kind of those reasons as well.
Let's see. Thank you for that. That was wonderful. I have another question here. Let's see, from Jessica, or Jess, sorry. Did the restaurants have a consistent approach to how beautiful their food or interiors were allowed to be? Were any of them worried about being too girly? That's a great question.
I really like this question. Okay, yeah. So I actually never found anywhere, like no one's ever mentioned to me this in like an oral history interview. And I never found it in any kind of writings about the sphere of girliness. There was actually this like exaltation of kind of women's aesthetics, which oftentimes was with like art, but also there was this kind of exaltation of craft. So I'm sorry to mention Bloodroot again. It's just like on my mind tonight. But so they also hold weaving classes. They have large quilts hanging from the ceiling. I'm also mentioning Bloodroot because you can actually visit it still, which is pretty cool. So there's also this kind of like, we want to challenge this idea of art. Like women have historically been really tied to kind of craft. And so they wanted to kind of celebrate that work. In terms of aesthetics, they varied. So there's some of the aesthetics that existed because they were operating on a shoestring, right? So a lot of places, like the plates didn't match and everything was secondhand or bought at estate sales, and so that created its own kind of aesthetic, just because of like actual financial need. But then there are some places where they try and think about like color palettes in the places. I'm thinking of like places where aesthetic was really kind of key. And I'm thinking about Val's Cafe, which was tied to the LA Women's Building. So the LA Women's Building was part of kind of the feminist art movement in Southern California with Judy Chicago and all of that. And there was Val's Cafe, which was in the space. And so I kind of see that as like tied to these kind of feminist aesthetics as well. But I don't really remember ever seen any fears of girliness. The only time that ever came up of like a rejection of imagery was actually in New York City. So Flavia Rando worked at the women's coffee house in New York City. She's also someone who's volunteered for a long time at the Lesbian Her Story archives. And I interviewed her. And she also is an art historian, and she put on art shows. And there was one time like a rejection of, I think, some of her own art. And they're also with Ruby's Cafe in the Midwest, there was also the issue of so the woman who operated the space, she always wanted there to be like women's art shows or queer art shows, like lesbian and gay was actually the word she used at the time. But she one time said that one painting couldn't be on the wall because it was really, really bloody looking, and she thought would like turn people off from eating. So yeah. So aesthetics, I never saw like a fear of girliness. And I would say that there's like different ways of kind of girliness being celebrated in some of the kinds of feminist spaces today, in this kind of like girly empowerment way of saying like, we are going to enjoy, I mean, it depends how you're defining girly, but we're going to enjoy flowers and pastel colors and like play and have a playfulness with it. And I see that in a couple cases. So Augusta Yearwood's restaurants, she had commissary and now she's rebranded it, as well as her chocolate shop in New Paltz, New York. And then she also has the place in New York City as well. And so there's like, there's use of like pastels, lots of like flowers and stuff like that. It's vegan, anarchist, feminist chocolates. So yeah, I think there's some like embrace of it, but also like embrace to also challenge, by embracing girliness, that itself becomes kind of a feminist movement too, is saying this is something valuable that we don't want to reject.
Yeah. Thank you. That was wonderful. So there you go, Jess. Do we have any other questions? I think we might have time for one more. I think we will wrap it up. I think the last thing I might ask you is what are the ingredients for a revolution?
Oh, wow. That's
not a big
question to wrap it up on. Oh my gosh. I think,
or you could leave it with, you have to read the book to find out.
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, we could say that, but I guess one teaser I would say is that I think feminist restaurants, cafes, and coffee houses are an ingredient for the revolution. Like they themselves are like part of this work, and they bring up a lot of questions and key things that we need to think about when we're thinking about the kind of world we want to build, what we want to strive towards. And when we're in a place of dealing with lots of social injustices, trying to think about the type of world and environment that we want to create, we can kind of look to them as models of they were facing a lot, and that yet there was this kind of hopefulness of what do we want to make? What do we want to bring to next generations? What do we want for ourselves? So I think that itself is a key ingredient for revolution. And yeah, and read the book for more, because there's a lot more in here. So thank you everyone so much for your questions. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for being.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ketchum. That was fantastic and so fascinating, and Dr. Hysmith, thank you so much for being such a skillful moderator. This is really, really wonderful. Just want to thank everyone so much for being here with us this evening. I'll be emailing you tomorrow. I'll send the recording link and some info about both of our wonderful speakers. And of course, if you haven't bought the book, I'll send you the link where you can do that as well. So hope to see you all very soon for more upcoming events, and good night, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.